With a few odd and largely parasitic exceptions, all plants require light to survive. They most often collect the light they require using specialized structures known as leaves. These leaves are held aloft on stems, sometimes quite a distance from the ground. One might ask why so many plant species bother to grow so tall. The most straightforward answer might be found in the competition for available light. If a plant grows taller than another plant, it gains foremost access to this vital resource. The shorter plant below must manage with whatever light slips through the leaves of the taller plant. Of course, there is a cost to reach such towering heights. Beyond a certain size range, the constraints of gravity require a fairly sturdy network of woody stems to hold up all of those leaves. There is also the increasing risk of falling over. This tends to be the eventual fate of most trees one way or another. There are several groups of plants that play this game a little differently, though. Rather than growing above their neighbors, they grow over them. Not only this, but they also grow over surfaces that are generally inaccessible to other large plants. Places like exposed rocks and cliff faces in the wild, or buildings in more settled locales. These climbing plants are in no great danger of toppling over as a tree might. They use their solid surroundings for support and so have no need to put so many resources into growing supportive stems. This allows them to put more resources into spreading further out over whatever they happen to be climbing. There are too many sorts of climbing vine to properly address altogether, so for today let us focus on just a couple of notable groups. Some of the most tenacious and potentially troublesome plants on Earth, so commonplace they are often overlooked as a part of certain landscapes. The various species that are commonly known as ivy. There are a number of plants that might be called ivy from several different plant families. The true ivies are in the genus Hedera within the family Araliaceae, sometimes known as the ginseng family. The word Hedera is basically Latin for ivy. Digging a little deeper, the etymology suggests a possible connection to the term for clinging or grasping. The common ivy, also known as English ivy, is probably the most significant species within this genus. While it is abundant in the British Isles, it grows natively in most of Europe and Western Asia. The species name is Hedera helix, and so the name roughly translates into ivy that coils, or perhaps a clinging coil. Oddly enough, most of the other species in this genus have names based directly upon where they are found. So, Hedera cyprea grows on the island of Cyprus. Hedera iberica is found on the Iberian Peninsula. Hedera nepalensis is found in the Himalayas in southwest China. Hedera algeriensis grows in Algeria and Tunisia, and so on. The species boundaries are a bit fuzzy for this genus, and one might regard at least a few of these species as mere subspecies of Hedera helix. Most of the differences are down to the precise shape of the leaves, though there are some cases of polyploid chromosome duplication as well. Granted, there are some species that grow in warmer climates like Hedera colchica, Hedera canariensis, or Hedera marocana. Some of the species are found quite a ways from Europe. For example, Hedera rhombea is native to Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Still, the basic anatomy and physiology are pretty similar across the genus, so a closer look at Hedera helix should be sufficient for understanding the genus as a whole. Probably the most abundant and visible feature of the common ivy is its leaves. These leaves are evergreen, persisting through the sub-zero temperatures of European winters. As such, the leaves are relatively thick and tough, with an almost leathery quality. They are also a fairly dark shade of green, though younger leaves tend to have a more vivid hue. Interestingly, the classic palmate five-lobed ivy leaf is one of two leaf types found on these plants. They are sometimes regarded as juvenile leaves, growing from stems that are closely pressed to whatever surface the plant is climbing. The mature leaves are distinctly different, having a heart shape without any lobes. These leaves grow from stems that extend outward from the ivy mat, particularly in the higher places. These stems also bear the flowers and eventual fruits of the plant. The flowers grow in roughly spherical clusters. The stem of each flower connects to the end of a single supporting stem, which in turn connects to the rest of the plant. This type of inflorescence is technically known as an umbel. These flowers are not particularly showy or impressive, but they are visited by many species of pollinating insect. After pollination, the flowers develop into berries. These are green at first, but depending on the subspecies, they typically ripen into either a yellow-orange hue or a dark purple color. A fair number of bird species rely on these berries as a food source. Still, this is not without some degree of trouble, as they are poisonous. They aren't at all suitable for human consumption, and even birds have to limit their intake, particularly when the fruits aren't entirely ripe. Still, as long as a bird doesn't eat too many of these little fruits at once, and waits until they are thoroughly ripened, it can manage well enough. Though not as obvious, the roots of the ivy are no less important than its leaves. This plant has the usual underground roots, but its stems also produce abundant aerial rootlets that allow it to cling to surfaces. These adventitious roots extend microscopic root hairs when they make contact with a surface. These minuscule hairs secrete an adhesive substance, and their cell walls acquire lignin deposits as they mature. This extra lignin toughens the tiny structures. Eventually, these little root hairs die and dry out. As they do so, they shrink and curl. This pulls the rootlet and the plant stem closer to the surface it is climbing. The end result is a series of stems that are very closely bonded to this underlying surface. Forcible removal tends to leave prominent markings made up of fragments of dead tissue and accumulated detritus. As might be expected, Hedera is a significant part of its native ecosystems. As mentioned before, it acts as a food source for the pollinators. The ivy bee, Coletes hederae, relies heavily on ivy as a source of both nectar and pollen. It will resort to other species if ivy isn't available, though. The ivy fruits are a food source for several sorts of bird, but there are also a number of insects that feed directly on the foliage. A species of geometrid moth, Idea seriata, feeds pretty well exclusively on the ivy leaves as a caterpillar. With its evergreen foliage, ivy is also useful as an overwintering site for a variety of smaller animals, invertebrates in particular. It is difficult to overstate its value as a habitat considering how large an ivy plant can grow. It can climb at least a good 30 meters off the ground, roughly 100 feet. With adequate time, a single ivy plant can pretty well cover an entire building. If there is no suitable structure to climb, it also does quite well as ground cover. As it plays such an integral role in nature, and because it is such a common and abundant plant, Hedera helix has coiled its way into the folklore and symbolism of several cultures. A few of its more prominent features lend themselves to cultural significance of one sort or another. The evergreen leaves and the tough persistence through cold winters have lent ivy a sort of spiritual significance. Sometimes it was brought into homes as a sort of charm against evil. The image of verdant green ivy overgrowing a dead tree can be a potent symbol for life after death. One can see such symbolism in some medieval Christian traditions. The clinging tenacity of the plant lends itself to ideas of persistence and strong bonds, so there have been traditions of priests giving ivy to newlyweds. This clinging and persistence has another context, as seen when an old building is overgrown with ivy. This may evoke a sense of nature reclaiming the passing endeavors of humanity. On the other hand, a venerable structure clad in ivy has an air of permanence and sophistication. This sense of aged prestige has most likely caused a number of established Northeastern American universities to be referred to as the Ivy League. There is another odd tradition with ivy connected with intoxication of all things. In Rome, it was said that an ivy wreath about the head could prevent drunkenness. As such, one can see the rather bibulous Bacchus depicted with a crown of ivy in several works of art. In the United Kingdom, an ivy bush or a pole wrapped with ivy has been a traditional means of advertising a tavern or a pub. While ivy is a wonderful thing in its native habitat, it is something of a nuisance elsewhere in the world. The plant thrives in any place with a reasonably cool and wet climate, and its remarkable tenacity can become quite a problem. It is so adept at survival that it can crowd out native flora where it is introduced as an invasive species. This results in large expanses of ivy and little else, sometimes referred to as ivy deserts. It can also overgrow small trees, weighing them down enough to topple them. Even larger, sturdier trees can be troubled by rampant ivy as its leaves start to overgrow their own, interfering with their photosynthesis. This would be bad enough to begin with, but there is another issue inherent to Hedera. It is toxic to humans, though thankfully this toxicity is not especially severe. In fact, it may be turned into something of a potential benefit. There is a fine line between poison and medicine, and as it turns out, ivy leaves may be used to make cough remedies. Of course, such preparations should only be made by professionals. I would not recommend trying to self-medicate by chewing an ivy leaf. That's asking for all sorts of trouble. Beyond the obvious stupidity of such a course of action, there is a potential danger in even the touch of an ivy plant. Certain sensitive individuals can develop an allergy to ivy, leading to severe contact dermatitis. For such unfortunate individuals, touching ivy is more or less the same as touching poison ivy. Incidentally, poison ivy is not in the genus Hedera, but rather the genus Toxicodendron. It isn't even in the same plant family as proper ivy. There is another climbing plant that is sometimes referred to as ivy. Parthenocissus tricuspidata is also known as Boston ivy, grape ivy, or Japanese ivy. It is originally native to Eastern Asia, being found in Korea, Japan, and nearby parts of China. In China, it is commonly known by a name that translates into wall-climbing tiger, which is perhaps more impressive than Boston ivy. This plant, and a few others in the genus, are grown in many parts of the world as ornamental plants. Unlike Hedera, the genus Parthenocissus is in the plant family Vitaceae, the same family that grapes are found in. The fruits are rather grape-like, growing in similarly arranged clusters rather than the umbels of true ivies. However, I would recommend avoiding these particular fruits. Boston ivy is quite poisonous to humans, despite its overall pleasant appearance. The genus name Parthenocissus roughly translates into virgin vine or virgin ivy. Another species in the genus, Parthenocissus quinquefolia, is commonly known as the Virginia creeper. This species can easily be distinguished from Boston ivy by the shape of its leaves. In fact, this difference is reflected within the two species names. Tricuspidata means 3 cusps or 3 points, and a Boston ivy leaf has 3 lobes. Quinquefolia means 5 leaves, and each Virginia creeper leaf is divided into 5 leaflets. While these plants readily climb walls, much as true ivy does, they use a somewhat different sort of structure. Rather than a dense outgrowth of fibrous adventitious roots, these plants produce small clusters of adhesive pads. When each of these pads contacts a surface, it secretes mucilage, which dries to form a strong bond. These pads deteriorate to a degree when the plant dies, but they can still leave something of a mark behind when they're removed. This form of bonding isn't quite as damaging or scarring as the myriad rootlets of Hedera, so even outside of their range, Parthenocissus plants are often grown for the purpose of covering buildings. This is not merely an aesthetic choice. The foliage is dense enough to shade the underlying structure, reducing cooling costs in the summer. The winter is another matter, however. Another difference between these climbing plants and the true ivies is found in their leaves. They are thinner than Hedera leaves and not quite as dark. Overall, they are relatively delicate in comparison. This is because both the Boston ivy and the Virginia creeper are deciduous, losing their leaves every winter. The leaves turn a vibrant shade of red before they fall, and this can be quite a sight. Even the bare stems clinging to a surface are impressive in their own right. All in all, the ivies, both true and false, are remarkably successful plants. They thrive in both rural and urban settings and have found a place in the mythology of several cultures. Hedera helix in particular has done quite well in this regard. This is all the more surprising when one considers that this plant is not a food source for humans, a building material, or the producer of any especially lethal poison. Though it is certainly an important part of the natural world, it has gained human recognition largely through its distinct aesthetic. It can readily evoke ideas of tenacity, enduring bonds, crumbling ruins, and distinguished edifices. It is a rather charming plant in its way, despite the problems it can sometimes cause. Thank you for listening. I hope you have enjoyed this brief glimpse into the more unusual side of the natural world. If you wish to know more, here are a few things that might be worth looking into. If you found this enjoyable, feel free to leave a like. If you think others would enjoy this content, by all means, share. If you have something to say or ask about, honest comments are always welcome. If you wish to see more from this channel, a subscription would be most helpful. Until next time.